we go, energy. And we'll start with electric power, talking about sensitivity. This, I think, is actually a really great place to pull up the map that Brianne's been making, that I want to just show everyone, sort of this resource that we have at our disposal here. Is everyone, you're seeing the map now? Okay, cool. This is switching is working. So this is Richmond, obviously. And if we were to pull up the electrical substation, there it is, and the power lines. There are some power lines. These maps are based on public data available, so it's probably not all the data that is there. And certainly if there are assets that you know of that aren't on a public map, we don't want to get bogged down in that, but certainly, we want to know about that. And we have mapped heat vulnerability based on sort of where's the urban heat island and expected increases in heat. As you can see, it's mostly in this upper portion of the city here, the census tracts, and then a little bit down in the south. And then flooding. So this is our 2030, 2050 flooding scenario and our 2070 flooding scenario. And this is, I brought this up because this is a really great example. There we go. There's our power station. It's actually kind of here, as I understand it. So this is definitely an asset where there is a potential flooding issue. So let's dive in. What are people sort of, for anyone who's I guess we put our representative from Dominion on the spot. If you're able to, if you have what knowledge you have about the sensitivity of the substation to flooding risk and what's sort of been done there.
Yeah, and I can talk generally about with when you think about water and a lot of the infrastructure acts. Obviously, water and power lines or substations don't mix. Generally, you want to keep flooding away from stuff like that. One thing I will say, just looking at other assets that we have and maps that we have of like substations and critical infrastructure in the Richmond area. The Belmead station is actually going to be retired soon, but there's plenty of other power station assets within the Richmond footprint. And if you go up, for instance, along the canal, there's a substation that serves a lot of the distribution lines in downtown that I imagine would be in that flooding footprint. So one of the things you'd have to consider is how do you build extended flood walls where, keeping floodwaters out of that substation. Generally with other power stations that you'd have around the area, the one that comes to mind would be the one over, and I don't think it's actually in the city limits, but there's a gas peaker station that's over near the landfill. I think it's in the Henrico County side, but that's a critical piece of infrastructure in high heat days. When you need those peaker units on or just high usage days. And flooding, if it were to reach that area or if you had localized flooding, generally don't mix with power stations as well. You've got a lot of underground tanks that store, key things. Also, anything that would impact natural gas supply would impact those stations as well.
Okay. That's a really helpful. There we go. That's the kind of thing we want here. Thank you for modeling the activity here.
And I could go on for quite a while.
I think that felt staged. Marshall, you two practiced that ahead of time, didn't you?
Not at all. Not at all.
So can I ask a question about your response?
Sure.
Or I guess this question might be for Marshall or Dawn, but given that you said what is the peaker plant that's just outside of the city limits?
So there, and it's killing me to not know the names of all of our stations. And I'm trying to pull it up on my maps right now.
I know we have Chesterfield, Bremo.
So Chesterfield's one. I mean, one thing to consider just in general is the grid is it's all shared. So stuff that impacts all over the state is going to impact Richmond, and things that could happen even in other states, like the blackout we saw in I guess it was 2004, 2002 that we saw in the Northeast, was something that happened in Ohio that knocked out the whole Northeast. So when you think about critical infrastructure, you bring up a great point. Even though Chesterfield's outside of the city limits, something that impacts Chesterfield could potentially impact Richmond, all of Central Virginia.
Great. And I mean, same thing, well, like natural gas pipelines, they don't just start at the city
Exactly.
limit. So
Yep.
how, as a group, how is this information going to be used? Or like what, is there anything that will be done with, I don't know, trying to phrase this better. Dawn, do you think like, will sustainability reach out to Chesterfield and say, hey, we've done this vulnerability assessment and it looks like, here's some information you can use? Or
Yes, I think there's all kinds of regional planning that will,
Okay.
come out of that. Sure.
Okay, thank you.
Mhm.
Yeah. And I would just say, additionally that, this is the energy asset group in part is particularly interesting because it does have this stuff that spreads across and is also mostly privately owned. So part of this exercise is identifying the people we're going to be working with and like what the avenues are. So there's a cooperative relationship here with Dominion to talk about the assets. Richmond's also engaged, with the State Corporation Commission, and there, will be also filings and regulatory proceedings, as time goes on that the city may get involved with around, arguing, in support of the need for additional resources for adaptation, for example, which I'm sure, Dominion would love to have because we need that. So it's just not necessarily confrontational, but there is a very strong role there, and it does spread beyond, but there is stuff that locally could be done in terms of increasing the amount of backup supply within Richmond, the amount of microgrids and islanding that can allow a location, a jurisdiction, a critical asset to exist even without the power. And we'll come back to sort of the impact of that when we talk about consequence. One thing I'm realizing that I totally failed to do was, remember how we said this was the first time we were running this exercise? Was we have an online survey that I'm going to put in the chat here, if I can figure out how to get to my chat from, there we go. I'm going to put in the chat here. So that's the, everyone should sort of pull this up. This is a sort of next to the screen here. This is a SurveyMonkey tool. I'll show you what it looks like. And as we're going through for each thing, so here we're in sensitivity. Again, we're talking about, the level of impact and trying to assess that. Assuming no action, how might climate impacts further stress this asset? For example, localized flooding, for example. 3, high will be largely affected by climate, extremely susceptible. 2 is sort of moderate, somewhat affected, moderately, or low is minimally affected, not very sensitive. And we'll be doing that for each of these assets. And we're sort of inviting everyone to do this. Certainly there's a not sure column if you feel like you really aren't sure, but if based on, even if you're not working on it, if based on the conversation, this is a thing you're like, okay, that sounds, electrical substation sounds high, for example, not trying to lead the audience, but for example, you would check this, and we're inviting everyone to sort of fill this, keep this loaded on your screen and fill it out as we're going along. Did everyone able to access that, or have any questions about sort of the way we're using the survey as we do this? Gonna take silence as we're all good. So
I think we're good.
All right. Back to the topic at hand. This is the same information. So let's talk about transmission lines. Similar concerns with 2 substations, but spread out across a bit more across the city. Anyone want to add sort of what's already been said about the sensitivity of the transmission infrastructure? I feel like heat is potentially particularly an issue here.
I was going to bring
think
that up
I'll-
today. Oh, go ahead.
Go ahead. Sorry.
Okay, as a citizen, as a non-electrical citizen, I notice in my neighborhood we get power outages, and I do believe it's cause of heat. And what it is people are running their heat pumps and their window air conditioners full blast. you know, as the temperatures rise or whatnot. I think it makes it more susceptible. And then just as a construction guy, I would imagine heat on these transformers becomes an issue. And so your older ones, I've had the power changed, and I had BEPCO out here in the backyard, and they changed the transformer, and I had a discussion about the longevity, about the resilience of these pole mounted transformers. Now with that, Eric, can you help me out and fill in the gaps?
Bill, you're spot on. Heat is generally the enemy of a movement of electricity across, whether it's distribution lines in your neighborhood or the big transmission lines. The more heat, the ambient heat that you have, the less that a resource can, less that a transmission line can move power. And it's, you know, when we analyze, you know, the transmission capacity, we look at thermal limits is basically the biggest limiting factor. So for instance, when we had that big, not to go back to that blackout, but that's always kind of the thing that's kind of the limiting or the big event that people think about, is that was caused by a really hot day, and people, that particular utility hadn't trimmed the lines around its transmission line. The lines droop when they get hot, and it just got close enough to a tree that they arced, took out the line, and cascaded all across. So as we think about those days where we've got high heat days on a continuous basis, not only are, there's that limiting the capacity of the lines, but as Bill mentioned, there are people using more electricity, which is just adding more stress to the lines. It's almost a cascading effect we think about. I've seen in our operations center, when we talk about really hot days in August, people start to get, not necessarily stressed, but a little, nervous when we think about the inundation of that. And it's only going to get worse as we see more, heat intense days going forward.
Awesome. I think, Jeff, were you going to say something?
Yeah, I think something we should really highlight here for water is with that extreme precipitation, with those associated increase in like landfalls from hurricanes, it's a direct threat to the infrastructure that could take it down dramatically. And typically you hear stories of, okay, well, we're going to bring in trucks regionally, cherry pickers, et cetera, to work on this infrastructure and assess and fix the damage. But as we have more and more hurricanes making landfall, those trucks are spread thinner and thinner and thinner. And there's also issues of supply from a people power perspective, where we have fewer and fewer. And Eric, I don't know, you could probably speak to this better than I can, but line workers is a trade that is few and far between and in high demand. So there's a calamity of effects that can come from the storms that we need to be aware of.
Yeah, Jeff, that's another great point. And you hit the nail on the head on that one too. We rely on something called mutual aid. So when there's a big storm, we work, let's say it's down in South Carolina, we send our linemen down there through kind of a mutual agreement with other utilities. If you've got hurricanes that are, back to back over a week, and it's taking a week to recover from one, you may not have assets. You may not have that mutual aid available because it's being utilized in other parts. So the more frequent those hurricanes are, you're absolutely right, the less we're going to have resources available.
And from a financial perspective, I'd highlight that is the whole downstream economy of energy. As personally, I know, insurance claims are incredibly strained right now because they're happening all over from this massive hurricane year, which is something that we need to consider from a financial perspective.
If you're following along, you'll see this is why I have this spreadsheet. I was just jumping over the consequences. We start talking about this. I also just want to highlight, this is a really great example of the way a chronic stress and an acute stress interact. You have the chronic impact of increased heat on these lines, not so much the hurricane one, though that's really important, but on the heat one, beginning to droop, and then that increases the vulnerability, and now we have the acute impact of the outage. So that's a really good example. Anything else anyone has to contribute on sensitivity of electric power before we move on here, just conscious of time? We're going to come back and talk about the ability of the system to adapt, though we've talked a little bit about that as well.
I wanted to add that weather events like flooding also reduces the lifespan of even poles, because most of our poles are wood. And I had just been doing some Googling, just fun fact for folks. 78% of major power interruptions in the US are caused by weather events. So that includes rain and lightning, wildfires, things like that. But, you know, that's a lot.
It's not squirrels.
That's the other 22%.
You're right, though, of course. Yeah. Which reminds us we should really rename this to electric power transmission and distribution, because that's really, the wood is really an issue on the distribution lines specifically. So, which were too many to put on the map, but we shouldn't let what can be on the map limit our analysis here. So, anything else on this? Again, we're going to come back to it. But... All right. That was really, really useful. I just want to flag that I'd love to follow up before I forget on the question of sort of getting the city better mapping on sort of where are the substations that not just are in Richmond, but that serve Richmond directly. So natural gas pipelines. We do have, I think, a small pipeline on the map, but this is again an area where it's really about, regional supply as well. Anyone want to speak to sort of their knowledge in terms of sort of the sensitivity of the gas pipelines? Do we have someone from Gasworks on the line here? I didn't think so, right?
It's not here today, no.
Okay. Anyone else want to speak to it?
Only just to highlight that this is a city asset as far as
Yep.
gas distribution, which makes it unique from some of the other topics we're talking about, where we serve surrounding localities from our gas utility. So we have a critical role in that regionally.
So if I'm understanding correctly, again, as an outside consultant, not only does Richmond Gas Works provide that service to Richmond residents, but you own the gas distribution infrastructure in the city and serving the surrounding area?
That is largely correct as someone who's not in utilities, but in finance. Yes.
I'll take it. And I've updated the public column here. This is certainly a thing we can follow up more with the, oh, please go ahead.
I did have one thought, and just as we've been talking, I've been trying to Google because I can't find relevant information, but as pipelines warm, well, gas expands. So I would, my conclusion would be, or my thought would be that as it warms, we would have more leaks from our natural gas distribution infrastructure. But that is probably something worth following up with the city and doing a little bit more digging on.
And following up on heat, this is just me speaking, not from data, but I believe, the primary use of natural gas heat in the region is in fact for heating. So if we're having, these increased temperatures, these milder winters that demand less natural gas, the financial resources and the kind of, business of the natural gas will lead to, lower money being realized for the utility, which could have issues as far as, money going back into upkeep of the distribution.
Absolutely. Both really good points, and definitely, and strong connections there, interconnections there with the with mitigation strategies around the question of sort of what are our energy sources in the future, and also, how much emissions are we having from distribution.
Hey, Marshall, I'm happy to follow up. I know little to nothing about gas distribution infrastructure, but we Dominion owns a couple of gas distribution utilities in Ohio and Utah. And I'm happy to follow up with those folks to find out what they're thinking about with respect to, climate change impacts from heat and water on their systems that
Yeah.
might be applicable.
Dominion also, correct me if I'm wrong, does Dominion own some of the regional gas pipelines, or were they were hoping to build them and it didn't happen? I've lost track. I'm sorry.
We actually, so we abandoned the ACP just recently, and around the same time, we also sold all of our gas transmission pipeline assets at the end of last year.
That's an asset outside Richmond, but one we do need to think about. Cool. Anything else on gas? We'll follow up with this. Yeah, the heat one is the expansion with temperature is an interesting one. The gas pipelines are usually, at least within the city, are usually underground. So I don't know to what extent they would be hit by temperature increases, but it's definitely something we should be looking at and thinking about. I confess I don't even know that fully. We'll come back to it after capacity. Petroleum ports and terminals. So just to review our sort of, I think the map again would be helpful here. So we're talking here about, I'm going to turn off this because you can't actually see it. So we're talking here about the petroleum port, and then all the terminals being sort of major places where it's being stored and then sent out for use and distribution. So questions here about, anyone either speaking from your actual expertise or just as some people have been doing, and I really want to invite this, lay sort of sense of sort of, these are some of the risks that, that might be an issue, or that as a user I'm concerned about. Definitely want to be hearing that expertise and those thoughts as well.
I don't think I want to see you lay future floods over where we keep our petroleum, but I think I know what that story is, right?
Yeah, that's fair. The leaks, environmental pollution from that.
I would think that even with the best petroleum storage tanks, warming and flooding would reduce the lifespan of the tanks themselves.
Yeah, definitely a possibility there. Are there places here where sort of this is also an interesting question where the question of sort of assets that might become less important in a low carbon future. And so, on one hand, it's less of a worry, but as we were highlighting with the gas, if less people are using it, that's less revenue to maintain it, and then you have a risk of declining investment, and that deferred maintenance can create a vulnerability as well.
Look no further than the Richmond Gas Works is kind of a past version of what happens when you let one of these sites go, and now it's undevelopable.
Can you tell that story a little bit quickly?
The Richmond Gas Works, kind of the Fulton Gas Works, it was a old gas site kind of over by Rockets Landing, and now it's not a Superfund site, but I think that's only because nobody wants to go digging there and doing soil assays, which would otherwise be very developable land in the region. So when we think about the expansion of Manchester with our current petroleum infrastructure, we're going to butt up against those historical energy infrastructure. When we go to, dig the next mid-high-rise apartment building that we're going to end up with.
So we are kind of learning as we go, and I'm noticing that Bob Stone is over in the other group, and he might be useful to this conversation from DPU. So how about if I jump over there
Yeah.
and you guys continue, and
Yeah,
I'll be
that sounds
back.
great. If you want to do that, definitely want to
Okay.
pull. If anyone you want to pull in from the other group, please go wrangle some folks. Not that we're not getting great insights here from all of you, but additional insights are useful.
All of this stuff, none of this exists in a vacuum. We are a city of systems. So you're actually getting a little bit more into what we might think about in the final part of our activity, which is consequence. So, that's beyond just this asset itself. If it were to be impacted by something, how does that affect the community? Public safety, public health, sort of the external impacts beyond just the building as we're thinking about it right now. So for adaptive capacity, probably think more about just the thing. And then once we get into the consequence in the next section, we'll be thinking about how critical that thing is to our city, to services that relate to natural environment, people, public safety, other things like that.
Okay, thanks.
Hey, Dawn, how's the other group going?
The other group is great, and I was trying to sneak in here and ask Bob Stone if he could come over to the energy group, because we would love to have his DPU knowledge, but he might have stepped away. I tried to privately chat him.
I'm here.
Oh, hey, Bob. Would that be okay if I grabbed you?
Sure.
Brought you over? All right, thanks, guys.
So I'll give you all, let's see, let me check on my.
And so then the question is, the gas utility is not signed on to this idea, to be clear. But then the question is, how do you balance and optimize for additional investment that prevents leaks and keeps the system maintained with not wasting ratepayer and taxpayer revenue on investing in an asset that is not going to be used, and thus creating a justification where, people are like, oh, we should continue to use this thing because we've been continued to spend on it. So that is more to highlight, I think, that this is a major challenge that I think folks are dealing with in the question of around natural gas and petroleum, and the question of sort of both climate adaptation and the transition to an economy. And I would also say that just the fact that a lot of the fossil assets are in flood areas is not uncommon, because you do have ports, and then you store things close to the ports. So I've been doing work up in Maine, and almost all of the petroleum terminals there are going to be underwater with sea level rise. So it's a problem. Dawn, were you successful or unsuccessful at recruitment? It looks like you were not successful.
Well, I was, but I don't know where he went. He might have clicked on something else. So he'll be in soon, I assume.
All right. While you were gone, we were just having a conversation about sort of what I'm seeing elsewhere in other cities and sort of the balancing of investment. I do want to try to very much definitely don't appreciate people being like, if you want to sort of pause the flow and ask questions, please feel free. But I do want to try to sort of go through the sensitivity so we can circle back here. Oh, there we go.
Hey, Bob.
Okay.
Awesome. Thank you for being here. So we have a small group, and we've been going through infrastructure. Marshall, Bob been with City of Richmond. I can't really speak for you, but has a lot of knowledge. He's an engineer, chief engineer with DPU, DPW, kind of can speak to all of the above.
All right, welcome. We've been going through talking about the sensitivity. We talked a little bit, and there's some notes up on the screen about electrical substations and transmission and distribution, and then natural gas and petroleum. We'll be coming back to talking about how those assets could could adapt and the consequence of failure. So definitely, I think we'll be circling back to those. And I think if you have thoughts circling back to sensitivity, we can get them at that point. Unless you're joining and then have to run very quickly thereafter or something.
No, I don't think so.
Okay, cool. So moving on, the next sort of section here are sort of biodiesel plants and non-gas and alternative fueling stations. This is sort of the opposite of, a asset area that's sort of growing with a low carbon economy and question. And I think some of the same, potentially the same questions and risks and some different ones. Does anyone have any thoughts about these in particular? I'm going to just copy this down here.
Marshall, what does it say on your energy asset types? What's the definition? Plants which
Yes, thank you.
manufacture.
Yeah, thank you for reminding me to go back. Sorry, there's so many things and I can't share them all at the same time.
I know you've got a lot going on.
Biodiesel plants are plants which manufacture diesel fuel from vegetable oils, animal fats, or greases. And then non-gasoline fueling stations would be public and private fueling stations for biodiesel, CNG, ethanol, electricity, hydrogen, propane, basically anything that's not gasoline. Yeah.
Where do we
I'm
have?
gonna cut through this. I don't know that we have any of those. Can anybody else speak to that?
We do. Well, we might. Let's look. Let's see if the map has
We
anything.
do have CNG refueling stations in the city.
Yeah, and there are a couple biodiesel producers within the city.
Yeah, I think Rico might be in the biodiesel business.
Yeah, Rico, I think, and
Yeah.
they are. There they are. And then this is a map of all of the alternative fueling stations in the city. These things. Some of those are probably in the floodplain. Yes. 1, 2, maybe.
Yeah, I know Rico's, they were flooded out pretty badly and gassed
Oh, they're
up.
right in the floodplain. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. So they were. This is a great example. I should have said this. If you know about past examples of flooding or heat impacts that we want to highlight here, this is particularly important, I think. Can you continue what you were saying about them being flooded out?
Oh, I'm just saying they are kind of smack on that overland floodplain, and they probably had about 6 to 8 feet of water through their facility during Gaston.
Do you know how that impacted them in terms of their obviously can't operate when you're flooded, but were there any sort of leak issues or other things, or were they able to get right back to operation after the flood waters receded?
They probably had a bit of a recovery period, I would think.
Yeah. Okay.
I'm not sure they were in the biodiesel business at that point in time.
Issues are the same. Okay, in the interest of time, I'm going to try to move on here. We'll talk about renewable energy sites. So we have a number that have been mapped. Where are they? Well, yeah, there we go. There's a number that are on this map, but obviously there's a lot more. Curious what sort of thoughts are on sort of ongoing or future planned renewable energy investment and what's seen there in terms of the vulnerabilities from heat and flooding.
Hey, Marshall, I think
Yes.
for majority of the renewables that are going to be developed within the city are likely going to be all stuff that's like rooftop, any sort of commercial CNI that's hopefully would be less vulnerable to flooding. if we're getting rooftop flooding, then I think we're in real trouble. But I think that they're going to be less vulnerable to those kind of things, at least from the solar perspective. Obviously, when we look at like utility scale solar out in the middle of the country, there's always risks of like localized flooding that may occur. But so for stuff in Richmond, I would imagine it'd be less vulnerable to and more resilient to water, and for that matter, heat as well. I think it would just run into the same issues as any electrical any electrical things would run into, higher heat, less efficiency, but in general, be going to be pretty resilient, at least on installations within the city. And this is just strictly solar, not any other, potential renewable assets.
Eric, as our solar expert, could I ask a noob question?
Sure.
When we're modeling the capacity for generations for these projects, when I hear Richmond is getting hotter and wetter, my assumption is that is it that we are getting more intense rain events, or are there more days where the sun is blocked by clouds? And does that go into our energy modeling if there is going to be a change in the solar days, so to speak? Is that something that we're anticipating or not?
We generally model based on historical weather patterns. Usually you take files that are essentially like a 10-year average. We haven't really projected out what the potential change in weather patterns could impact, but if you did see more cloudy days, more rainy days, and higher heat days in general will reduce efficiency, although not to the amount that a cloudy day would, or anywhere close, but more cloudy days means less production. So if that's where we're headed that's beyond the average that we've predicted that we're using in our forecast for generation when we build assets, then absolutely we would see impacts to our renewable energy and just less production and less efficiency going forward, less capacity factor.
It's a great question and a great point. Generally speaking, with climate impacts, we're looking at things becoming more intense. So storms dropping a lot more rain when they drop rain, and being otherwise a lot more dangerous. And then floods being more dangerous simply because of, also the impacts of sea level on the tidal portion of the river. But so I don't know about the impact of number of cloudy days. So just say, but this is also an area where, I think we do want to be highlighting places where it's not just vulnerabilities, but where there are strengths. And so if we have an asset where we feel like that's actually fairly resilient because of its, rooftop location and so forth, that's, I think a really good thing to highlight. So thank you. I mean, there are some cities looking at ground mount solar within the city limits, especially where you have like a brownfield site that might be hard to develop for other reasons. So that could be a thing the city has to look at, and then flooding could be a concern there.
Throw the Fulton Gas Works on for one of those potentially. Yeah.
Circling back. Finally, on sensitivity would be communications infrastructure. So here we're talking about AM, FM transmission towers, television transmission, cellular towers, and this sort of thing. Do we have any expertise thoughts on that from a vulnerability into I'm curious how that is impacted by maybe the cascading impacts from power outages would be one I would guess. No one wants to talk about radio transmission. That is okay.
I had one thought. And
thought.
Infrastructure that would include like cell phone towers, right?
Yes, absolutely. I think
okay.
Maybe I didn't. My apologies.
Well, so we know extreme weather events are going to increase in frequency, and whenever there's a really catastrophic event, it seems like cell service is insufficient. It's not necessarily that like the towers themselves have been damaged, but just that, people are trying to check in on loved ones and neighbors and coordinate their efforts. So I don't know how much of an issue that is. how likely we are to see impacts like that. You know, if there was a huge flood, I would think that whether it's, you know, towers getting knocked over or people just using their phones a lot, we would probably have some effects to our service.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. I mean, and especially as we move to having more and more things relying on cellular connections, that's sort of a real point of sort of social vulnerability.
Yeah.
From the lack of being able to get service when you most need it. So thank you for that.
Hey, Marshall.
So, you
Yes?
know, let me ask, I don't know if everyone has the survey for this.
Yeah,
Bob,
yeah.
you may not have that energy survey that we distributed the link to earlier so that you
Yeah.
guys can be making notes.
Yeah, I was going to actually, Dawn, say exactly that. If everyone could go, before we move on, if everyone could sort of, if you haven't been doing this already, go back to the sort of the survey. When you go to the survey, you'll see there's a ranking again from 1 to 3, low to high, for sensitivity to heat threats and sensitivity to water threats, and also a place to put in comments. So if there's anything you want to add that you haven't said that you'd like to add here, please do that. Ran, what happened to your buildings group?
Oh, I was just popping in to say hi. The buildings group is working very dutifully and silently. So I wanted to see how it was going over here in terms of time.
We're mostly just talking, I feel like.
Okay.
But maybe that's because I haven't been emphasizing the survey enough.
Oh, well, all right.
I just put the link in the chat again for anyone who lost track of that survey.
Okay. Wanted to do a check-in on time as well. Yeah. What part of the activity
we
are you
finished
on?
sensitivity. We're moving on to adaptive capacity. So
okay, we're going to finish a little early, so I'll probably just, you know, invite folks back to the main room, and then y'all just come back in whenever you're ready.
Okay.
Okay, thanks.
Cool.
Marshall, I've got a quick question. I don't know
Yeah.
Now how much this has been looked into, but when we think about weather threats and extreme rain and rainfall, how much of there has been an assessment of the threats of flooding, like localized flooding in areas that you wouldn't necessarily predict, like things that aren't in floodplains along the river, but just localized areas where drainage isn't what it used to be from development, or just wasn't built for the amount of rainfall that we may see?
Can you just put that in the comment? Because we should have asked that 30 seconds ago. Brianne was still here because she's been doing the analysis on that. I don't know the answer to that, I'm afraid.
Okay.
But if you could put that in the comments under sort of the sensitivity to water threats, that would be great.
Absolutely.
I do want to move us on in terms of time, but please do fill out the survey if you haven't already. Has anyone had trouble accessing it or any questions about the survey?
I'm trying to read here. Adaptive capacity. Now,
Yep.
Now, Eric, are you need to speak up for and protect your employer here.
That's where we're about to move to now. So yeah, let's talk about that. So adaptive capacity here, the ability of a system to respond or recover in the face of an impacts. So again, we're looking at how is it mostly or entirely able to accommodate projected changes? Again, high is good in this case, as opposed to last time where high is bad. Somewhat able or minimally or not able to adjust to projected impacts in the climate here. And the overall question I think we want to be asking as we're going through this is, if the asset was impacted by extreme heat and flooding, can the infrastructure adjust to the climate threat with no modification, or is substantial modification or cost or relocation required? So we've sort of talked about this a little bit, but let's sort of go back and looking at the electrical infrastructure. Since we're putting Eric on the spot, we'll put Eric on the spot about electrical infrastructure, the adaptive capacity of the substation and the transmission and distribution lines in terms of sort of ongoing investment and locations and so forth. You mentioned the need to build flood walls, so I'm curious sort of what has been done already in terms of flood wall building versus whether this is an area where there's a real need to still do that.
Yeah, and I'm happy to kind of talk both specifics to things within the city and just kind of broadly on impacts to substations and electric power and distribution lines. You know, when it comes to the one piece of like critical infrastructure that when I was looking at maps on, I've got Google Earth open with some stuff. The one that comes to mind that's specific to Richmond is the one down along Haxel Point, right there in the bridge that goes to Manchester. There is a substation right there that services that I imagine if you were to zoom in on it, it'd be absolutely in that floodplain. I know that that's something that the team is constantly looking at threats as part of reliability and both as part of integrating renewables and the changes that's going to happen to our grid, but also just threats from climate change going forward. So that is something that we would have to identify as an upgrade. The teams and the transmission distribution are constantly identifying potential threats to all of our substations. We've just done a whole bunch of upgrades from a security perspective to critical infrastructure to upgrade like fencing against threats from like terrorists and things like that. This is something that's coming to the forefront. Generally, when we're talking about upgrading our substations, and I'll talk about this for electric and power distribution, transmission distribution lines, we've got the Grid Transformation Security Act, which focused on how do we upgrade the grid to be more resilient, not only for integrating renewables and demand side management and all of the great things. I know Jessica would love to talk about all the kind of like energy efficiency related things that could potentially be integrated with that, but also upgrading for resiliency going forward with the changing climate and everything that's going to be changing to our grid going forward. So there's already been some legislation that's put money in, but it will take investment. There's no doubt about it that we're going to have to invest in upgrading our grid, both transmission and distribution, to mitigate the impacts of both heat and water.
Is there an ongoing sort of comprehensive sort of planning effort to look at that, or is this being sort of similar to what you mentioned for the security, or is this still sort of being done somewhat more in an ad hoc?
So it's a constant process of looking at potential threats to reliability. There's everything related with the Grid Transformation Security Act, but also and a lot of stuff behind closed doors in understanding threats. But our transmission and distribution functions are constantly analyzing new threats that may evolve and looking at the potential upgrades that are needed.
Yeah. Are they looking at sort of if they're looking at sort of heat stress from the perspective of future climate and increased heat and sort of the sensitivity of particular substations to that?
I think they're looking at it from a more broad. I'd have to talk to our transmission and distribution folks that are. Yeah, they're in more thing. I think there actually might be, and I'll look it up to see, there might be a PJM working group that's focused on it from a reliability perspective on the impacts. And PJM's our regional transmission operator. I think there might be one, but I can look into that as well. That's looking into the impacts of climate change.
Okay, that would be helpful to know.
Maybe Bob could speak to the Richmond substations for street lighting and wastewater and water utility and transmission lines.
Yeah, certainly, that'd be great.
Most of them are relatively well, either not in flood prone areas, like even like the water plant that's within a protected flood wall system. Wastewater plant, that electrical infrastructure is on some of the highest ground there at the plant, so it's relatively flood safe.
Do you know how high those flood walls are estimated to be able to protect against? Because I think one thing we want to be thinking about is sort of, it may be well protected now, but is it protected well against the kind of floods we're going to see in 50 years?
Yeah, I wouldn't say never say never, but it's, yeah.
And how about street lighting? They have their own substations.
Yeah, don't recall any significant issues with them in Gaston, which was probably like north of 1,000-year recurrence event. So I don't know that we've got much in the way of vulnerability there. But
Okay.
I know Dominion had at least 3 Richmond area substations get flooded during Gaston.
It's helpful. We're sort of time here. We're running out of time here. So let's talk. I think, I guess I'm just going to ask people sort of from adaptive capacity, whether sort of for the, I think there was a bit less that people had to say about the other areas, the natural gas pipelines and the petroleum and so forth. And I'm curious if there are particular thoughts people want to bring up on those.
Yeah, Bob, we don't have anyone here from Richmond Gas. Could you speak to that?
Yeah, I think that there is some vulnerability, particularly with water for pipelines. We had, you could have sections of roadway or earth get washed out that have pipelines. I mean, one that comes to mind was like down at Government Road and Williamsburg Road during Gaston. We had sections of the roadway flood out that took some water and gas pipelines with it.
So that's an area that we need to sort of look at. That's helpful. Again, on the survey here, we have the same sort of thing. We invite everyone to sort of fill out your own thoughts on sort of the adaptive capacity to this. So for example, we've already heard, I think that it sounds like for the renewable energy, the adaptive capacity is pretty high because of the limited vulnerability, limited vulnerability there. But it seems like there's maybe less for the pipelines and for the petroleum ports. Sort of be conscious of time here. I would like to try to move on to, I feel like we talked a lot and now I'm rushing us, but I'm realizing it's 12:45 here. So I want to sort of, with the survey, you can move on and forth. You can move, the final thing is consequence. And consequence is really divided up into a whole bunch of different areas here. We're looking at the sort of area of service loss, duration of service loss, cost of damage, public safety. What are the impacts to well-being of residents, workforce, and visitors with regard to safety? What are the impacts to government economic activities? What are the impacts to public health for the well-being of residents, the workforce, and visitors? And then specifically, what are the impacts to vulnerable populations that are already disproportionately impacted by inequalities? And then finally, what are the impacts for natural resources, including land, water, tree canopy, vegetation, and animal habitat? And obviously, we're not going to have time to go through each of those consequence issues for each area, but the survey does give you the ability to do so. So what you'll see when you go to the survey is there's, you can fill out high, medium, low for the impacts at each element. So we have electrical transmission lines for all of them, substations for all of them. It says Bellmead, but please sort of answer more broadly for all the substations we've talked about, natural gas pipelines, et cetera. So I sort of invite people in the last time here to sort of fill that out on your own. And also, but if you have thoughts particularly that you want to share with the group around any consequences as you're thinking about this, please do so. And there's a little chart there that I'll just sort of I'll put up here for people to look at, sort of a sense of sort of what we're talking about when we talk about high, moderate, and low in general, though I think it can vary by asset. So I think even a full day's outage for electricity is, has a pretty high impact.
Hey, I got a question for
Yeah.
Bob, our engineer. I go and I go down to Bell Island as much as I can to enjoy the river as best I possible. I understand that Bell Island actually housed a Dominion power plant at one time, long ago, and it was flooded out. Does the city itself have anything like Browns Island or Bell Island? Do they have any, resources, infrastructure still in place? And are there any plans to revitalize? Now talking about flooding,
To
but what,
revitalize hydropower?
well, hydropower, is there anything there that's functional? I remember reading a plaque one time about the sewers, Richmond has had to request permission to release some of the sewers during flood stages sometimes. So somebody's monitoring what's going on with our plumbing infrastructure down that low, down in the bottom, Bell Island, Browns Island. So what's going on down there? Is there anything that is changing? Is anything need to be looked at?
Hmm.
Anything you don't want to talk about in public?
No, I mean, we're constantly looking at, the combined sewer overflow program. Like I say, as far as hydro, the only remaining infrastructure, I think, is at Bird Park. We still have some hydro turbines in one of our pump stations there that haven't operated in decades,
So there was something there in a renewable energy type capacity?
yeah.
Okay.
I believe the south side, that vacant structure was a hydro powered that powered some of the first streetcars and stuff, from some historical knowledge I have. I've always thought it would be cool to be an interpretive, sustainability education site right there on the river, but issues of access, ownership, et cetera, et cetera.
Dawn, we need your help. Looks like a project for you. You're not going anywhere.
We don't have the money, I can tell you that now.
Well, that's all right. Eric's got plenty of money. Plenty of our money, and it comes in on a monthly basis. I can assure you.
Yeah, I know. Speaking, I guess, a lot of the hydro stuff came off the Kanawha Canal, and there's been, I guess, regulatory issues over the last maybe 20, 30 years on how much water we divert from the James River into the Kanawha Canal, and kind of so we're kind of limited in what we can pull off the river, particularly during drought periods.
Yeah. I think I've seen definitely in a lot of cities, there's been this shift away from sort of small local hydro at rivers to, this hydro still plays a major role in power in some parts of the country, especially out west and in the Northeast. But here, I think for renewables, it's increasingly much more just solar and wind.
And this is really small scale stuff.
That was small.
Probably just not economically feasible.
It's
in
not.
This area.
It's not. On consequence, people filling that out. Question. Any thoughts on the sort of consequence issues we're having around the sort of the duration and area of service loss around, say, the electrical infrastructure in particular?
So for the survey, the consequence is not how likely do we think the system is to fail?
No, the consequence is, if this system were to fail, what is the consequence of this? So if the electrical substation failed, what is the consequence in terms of the potential cost of the damage, the duration of the sort of level of service loss we see, the economic impacts, vulnerable populations impacted, and so forth. If it were to fail, natural gas pipelines, if pipelines were to be knocked out, what is the impact there? If the ports are knocked out, what's the impact? So some of the environmental impacts might be higher than the local you know, service impacts if, you know, if it's not even serving the local area, say the petroleum ports, for example.
Would we be making the assumption that, say, for communications infrastructure, it's one tower that goes out or all the towers? Or for pipelines, is it one pipeline or all of them?
I'd say I think the assumption would be, I mean, obviously the area of service loss is a function of that.
Right.
So I see what you're saying. I think answer as you see fit, certainly, I think would be the thing I would say there.
Okay, thank you.
Unhelpful perhaps, but.
Yeah, I mean, it's a great point because there are going to be several different levels of failure. So we want to be thinking about all of them.
Yeah, and also thinking about, but it's a great point also to think about the cascading failure, because you have one pipeline fail. You know, with electrical infrastructure, you definitely see this. You have one line fail and you have cascading impacts, you know, potentially all across the region, or the Northeast in one case, as we've been talking about several times. Pipelines, you know, what is or cellular service, you know, you could have a local outage, but other things trying to compensate you could have a cascading impact.
Okay, so about 1 more minute. Oh,
Yep.
Just popped up.
Who's ever sent me this Bell Island thing, thank you very, very much. This is exactly what I was looking for. I don't know how you sent it to me directly.
No worries. There's all kinds of cool stuff on Bell Island. You can dig into it.
It's absolutely wonderful. Thank you, Jeff. I appreciate it.
No problem. All right, I'll see you guys in the main group.
Yeah, I think we're gonna rejoin the group. Thank you.
Thank you, Marshall.
You're welcome.